Okay then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 125. I am your host, Panyabasa. And these blue reflections in my glasses, in my spectacle lenses, are because a certain person has strongly urged me to look at the questions on a bigger screen so that I won't be squinting and going like that trying to read them. And the moral of the story is there's always a trade-off. You know, everything has its good side and its bad side. So, I mean, I could just kind of go like this all the time, then you don't see the reflection, or go like this, which is the reason why this whole blue screen thing was suggested in the first place. So we're just going to deal with you guys not being able to see my eyeballs very well. And we don't have a whole lot of questions today. I might as well just wade into them after presenting the beverage. And taking the preliminary sip to lubricate my talking muscles and so forth. So let's get right to it. First question is from Maitreya Buddha. And Maitreya Buddha says, what are your thoughts on Osho, also known as the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh? And it turns out that I've written a few articles or essays about Osho, or at least featuring Osho prominently. One of them was called the something of the enigmatic Bhagwan, the case of the enigmatic Bhagwan. And I haven't refreshed my memory. I mean, I wrote them years ago and I haven't reread them just to answer this question, but it's just the way it is. So anyway, what are my thoughts on Osho? I mean, I was raised in Aberdeen, Washington, which was maybe 100 miles or so from Oregon. We got Oregon TV stations. And so when the Bhagwan, as he was called then, was living in Antelope, Oregon, which then turned into Rajneeshpuram, Oregon, I was seeing all the news about it. And consequently, as a kid, you're pretty much, I mean, just as a normie back then, kind of, you get your mind poisoned against the whole Rajneesh thing, you know, because the mainstream media were just portraying him as some creepy cult leader. And so, you know, at first he was just kind of a joke. And then I started reading like both sides of the issue. I was reading, you know, like anti-cult people talking about him, but also people who are like sympathetic to him, writing about the same sort of thing where, I mean, in a way, there's two sides of the story. I mean, he wasn't just this fraudulent cult leader. But on the other hand, I don't think that he was a fully enlightened being. Or if he was, then the Buddhist conceptions of fully enlightened beings might as well just be chucked out the window. One thing that's kind of interesting is one of my favorite Dharma teachers or spiritual teachers that are still alive today, I'm pretty sure, is Paul Lowe. And it wasn't until after I started liking Paul Lowe that I found out, to my amazement, that he was the right-hand man of Osho, known as the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh in those days. And this was at his ashram in, I think it was Pune, India. And then when the Bhagwan and a lot of his supporters and disciples moved to Oregon in the United States, he got sort of pushed out through political maneuvering. He and Sheila didn't get along very well. Sheila was the notorious new right-hand person of the Bhagwan who sort of took over the ashram when the Bhagwan was in his reclusive, possibly drugged stage. And she wound up going to prison for attempted murder. She was like trying to poison people, this sort of thing. So all in all, my thoughts on Osho, I mean, I've read a few of his books also, and he seems more glib than profound. He could sit there and talk for 3 hours on spiritual matters, but you read his books and there's nothing really original. there's nothing really striking about it. It's just sort of a glib, recountal. Is that a word? He just recounts all this. I mean, he's sort of recycling other spiritual traditions and just doing it very glibly. And really, it didn't strike me as particularly profound. On the other hand, I met a few of his disciples when I was in Bali, in Indonesia. And I asked them, there was one, he was a German artist. Nowadays, he's a German artist living in Indonesia. I asked him if he thought the Bhagwan was enlightened, and he just kind of rolled his eyes, went, psh, it was obvious. He was certainly enlightened. And then I was speaking to another disciple of the Bhagwan who still had the name given to him by the Bhagwan. And he was sort of non-committal. You know, he didn't want to say yes or no, really. But my theory on the Bhagwan is, with regard, this applies to a lot of spiritual teachers, not just Osho, the Bhagwan, Sri Rajneesh, is that they probably had some kind of awakening experience. Like they had a shift into higher consciousness that kind of gave them certain powers. Also, the Bhagwan just had like the large hypnotic eyes, you know, the resonant voice, the ability to talk for 3 hours straight, that kind of thing. But I mean, just because you're at a higher level of consciousness doesn't necessarily mean that you're a saint. Like a monkey is at a higher level of consciousness than a sheep, but a monkey's a lot nastier than a sheep. So I'm willing to admit the possibility that he did attain some higher level of consciousness, short of full enlightenment, but it didn't really make him a saint. You know, sort of like being at a higher level of consciousness than a sheep doesn't make a monkey a saint. In fact, you know, like in Buddhism, you've got Mara, the evil one, who made it into a very high heaven realm. The devil, you know, the Buddhist approximation of Satan isn't chained up in hell. He's up in the highest heaven realm of the sensual sphere, the highest heaven of the Kamaloka, you know, which is it's like the heaven of gods who delight in the creations of others, I think it's called. And he got there through meritorious deeds and through mental cultivation and attaining higher levels of consciousness. And then he winds up being sort of like the Buddhist tempter. So I would say that Osho did get some sort of realization, but it was like a partial one, and it was not sufficient in causing him to become a saint. It just sort of caused him to have a certain charisma, a certain ability to influence like the minds of others kind of stuff. You know, and there might have been some con man thrown in there too. Con men can do it without having attained higher mental states. But I am willing to assume that he had attained something that put him on a higher level than the average Joe. But I'm very skeptical of the very idea that he was fully enlightened. Although there are other people who claim to be enlightened who say that Osho was enlightened, like the notorious Jed McKenna, which is probably an alias, who says Osho was enlightened, and he declares himself to be enlightened also. So, I mean, I can't really say for sure one way or the other, but personally, I'm rather doubtful of certain people like Osho, or Daniel Ingram would be another case. There are certain other category of sort of eclectic gurus who may be enlightened that I would place maybe in a higher likelihood than Osho himself. Paul Lowe I would consider to be more likely to be highly spiritually advanced than Osho, at least from a Buddhist perspective. Somebody like Eckhart Tolle, people like that, I would probably put above Osho, but it's just a guess. And I'm going with preconceived notions about what an enlightened being would be like, based largely on Buddhism. And from the Theravada Buddhist point of view, you have to be an absolute saint. You have to have perfect morality before you can perfect your mind. which means, of course, you're not going to be like Osho, who gets first pick of all the pretty sannyasins, for example. And everyone freely admitted to that. So those are my thoughts on Osho for the time being. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Amy. We got another kind of a Bhagwan question here, which is, what do you think of the Bhagavad Gita? So Bhagavad and Bhagwan, same etymology. But the Bhagavad Gita is more orthodox Hinduism, I guess. It's not Vedic. Technically, I don't think it counts as a scripture, but it might as well be scripture. I mean, it's not a Vedic text, but it has influenced the spiritual life of modern day Hindus at least as much as the 4 Vedas. Or in the Buddhist time, it was still just 3 Vedas. The Atthakavagga Veda got added later. So what do I think of the Bhagavad Gita? I think it is a profound text. If I had to make a list of all the major sacred scriptures of the world religions that I have read in order of profundity, the Bhagavad Gita would be, it'd be well up into the top 50%. Something like the New Testament might be kind of around the middle. The Old Testament would be down towards the bottom. But the Bhagavad Gita, it does have a lot of wisdom to it. And I have read that the Bhagavad Gita was composed around the beginning of the Christian era. And, like 1st century BC to 1st century BCE, no, AD, CE, BC to AD, and part of it was like a polemic, like an argument against Buddhism, because Buddhism really was much, much more popular in India 2,000 years ago than it is now. Whether it was the Buddhists or the Hindus that were in the majority 2,000 years ago, I'm not sure exactly. It may be that India was a predominantly Buddhist country 2,000 years ago, but the Hindus hung in there. The Vedic Brahmins hung in there. And the Bhagavad Gita was sort of an argument against Buddhism. Like, for example, towards the beginning where Krishna is persuading Arjuna to fight in the great Bharata war. And he's saying essentially arguments that in Buddhism are considered to be a kind of wrong view, which is, everything is ultimately divine and immortal, so you can't really kill anybody. So I do think it is possible that part of the Bhagavad Gita had it had certain digs against Buddhism because they were very much in competition for cultural and spiritual ascendancy over the Indian subcontinent at the time. But it's well worth reading. It is a profound text. Anyone who's inclined towards theistic thought, you prefer to believe in a God, you prefer to identify the absolute, the highest principle, whatever, as God, then, the Bhagavad Gita is it's profound as a monotheistic text. More so, in my opinion, than the Bible. Although a lot of Christians, most Christians would disagree with that assessment. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from RPAD or RPAD. He says, could you please elaborate on the distinction between not self and no self? And he's referring to the Buddhist idea of anatta. In Pali, in Sanskrit, it would be anatman. But in Pali, it's anatta, which is the language of Theravada Buddhism. And there are some teachers like Ajahn Thanissaro is one of the more higher profile ones who don't like the translation of no self for anatta. The an means not or no, and the atta means self. And the main reason why someone would object to no self and prefer not self is if deep down they still have self-view. They want to believe that there is a self. They just want to assume, as a general rule, that the Buddha was just saying that none of the 5 aggregates, none of the 5 khandhas are self. And so that kind of leaves the door open to something else being the self, something like the absolute or nirvana, some formless universal, infinitude, the absolute, the highest truth or whatever, that could still be called the self. And the Pali texts just do not say this. For the Buddha to say that there is no self, or to say, none of the five khandhas are the self, but still there's a self out there, but he doesn't say that still there's a self out there. He just says none of the five khandhas are the self. And then also in another text, he refers to the all, as the five khandhas. That is the universe. The universe is the five khandhas. So you got people like Ken Wheeler. I mean, I don't know if he still does this. I haven't seen him. I haven't watched any of his videos in a long time. But he used to just pound away at the idea that when the Buddha says, the five khandhas are not self, that really you should not have the idea I am. Like in the Atthakavagga, a very ancient, primordial kind of Buddhist text, it says that the root of all delusion and misery is the conceit I am. And that's self-view, essentially. Or that's a very fundamental way of having self-view, is just thinking, I am. So really, the people who quibble about no self and prefer not self, in my opinion, as a general rule, deep down, they still have self-view. They want to believe that they have a self. And so they're using that as a kind of loophole to get around no self and just say, well, the Buddha was just saying none of the five khandhas are the self, thereby tacitly leaving the door open to some other kind of self, like the Atman in an Upanishadic sense. Although Buddhism really does not support that. At least the texts don't. The early texts don't. The closest the early texts come to any kind of loophole like that is by saying you shouldn't have any view at all. You should not believe that there is a self. You also should not believe that there isn't a self. The reality of the situation is completely off the scale, and just trying to put it into words is going to be invalid. You're going to just start off on the wrong foot. So, no self means there is no self. Not self means there maybe is a self. It's just sort of, it's not conditioned. It's not a sankhara. It's not a conditioned thing. That it's some kind of formless, immortal entity or some such that is never specified in the texts. And it's really a lame kind of argument where someone is saying, well, the Buddha says, there is no self. Sabe dhamma anatta. Anything, no matter what, not just conditioned things. Sabe dhamma anatta means anything is not self. Anything, even Nibbāna itself. It's itself, I say. But it's like you got the three marks of existence. Sabe sankhara anicca. All conditioned things are impermanent or inconstant. Sabe sankhara dukkha. All conditioned things are conducive to unease, dissatisfaction, suffering. But it switches on the third one. Sabe dhamma anatta. And that the Dhamma is used instead of Sabe Sankhara, it says Sabe Dhamma, because it's referring to absolutely anything. The first two apply only to samsara. The third one applies to absolutely anything. Nothing is a self. There is no self. And some people, like Westerners especially, who grew up in a Christian culture or sort of a vestigially Christian culture, they just cannot deal with that. They can't cope with it. And sometimes they just vehemently, even angrily insist that the Buddha taught a self, when the evidence indicates that he certainly did not. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, can you please do an analysis of Ajahn Thanissaro's writing on Nibbana? It's his attempt to give an overall description based on how he interprets the suttas. So I'm curious which point of his you would agree and disagree with, and which things you would interpret differently. Please ignore the part about Nagarjuna in the beginning. Well, I'm ignoring the whole thing. It's just too long, didn't read. I mean, it's very long. I don't know if it's an entire book or not, but I'm not going to read an entire book or even a very long article. Just, read this entire thing and what are your thoughts on it? No, I'm just not going to do that. Although I did read a book by Ajahn Thanissaro called The Mind Like Fire Unbound, in which is the main topic is Nibbana. And it's like the first book where he puts forth his argument for translating the word Nibbana as unbinding, which I think is kind of a lame translation, but obviously he doesn't think so. He's got his own reasons. I mean, literally Nibbana pretty obviously means blowing out, like the blowing out of a flame, the blowing out of a candle, that kind of a thing. So the mind like fire unbound, he puts forth the argument that, like, to the ancient Indians, fire was a god. It was the god Agni, like the messenger of the gods, sort of like Mercury to the Romans. Or I guess there were other messenger gods too. Iris, I think, maybe, to the Greeks. But it was, because it was a god, it sort of was everywhere. And it was like the latent spirit of fire was already found in wood, for example, before you set it on fire. It's like to the medieval alchemists, there was a substance called phlogiston that supposedly existed in like flammable objects like wood that was released when the fire burned. And so the ancient Indians, according to the Ajahns' argument, saw fire the same way, that there was sort of like manifest fire, which would be an actual flame, and then there was unmanifest fire, which was kind of a potential that pervaded pretty much the universe. And so the Ajahn put forth this argument that that's how the early Buddhists saw nirvana also, is that, I mean, it could be like the blowing out of a fire, but the fire isn't extinct. It just becomes unmanifest. It just kind of goes off the scale, so to speak. And I mean, if you take it that far, I could pretty much agree with it. But the thing is, when you start talking about it as an it and start insisting about it, that sort of thing, you've reified it, which is a no-no for ancient, like early Indian Buddhism. To reify the absolute just drags it into the mud, and it's no longer the absolute. It's just kind of delusional. So you're better off just not trying to explain it, because any explanation is going to be invalid. So, yeah, but the Ajahn, he definitely does have a kind of eternalist and self-view kind of tendency towards, with regard to himself. He does kind of like eternalism of a sort and self of a sort. But it's kind of in fashion in like the Thai forest tradition in which he was ordained. And so there are a lot of Thai forest Ajahns who refer to the mind, or jit, as the one who knows, the one who sees, this kind of thing. And it may be due to some Mahayana Buddhism or Hinduism that also kind of got absorbed into Thai culture, centuries ago, that just kind of went mainstream in Buddhism there. Certainly Burmese Buddhism doesn't have that. So for whatever reason, the Venerable Ajahn does kind of like somewhat of an eternalist view and somewhat of self-view. So I'm just going to move on to CO of Action, Sipad Zidrna's next question. which is as follows. You have talked about being skeptical about the non-percipient rebirth because karma can't be burned off when there is no mind there. However, since people do become unconscious in the real world and can do so via anesthesia, injury, or other means, and you say karma can't be burned off while there is no mind, then how do you explain people going completely unconscious in the real world if karma has to ultimately explain it happening as well? Well, I mean, there is no gap from the mental point of view. That if you go into a coma, you're completely oblivious to any passage of time, and subjectively, there was no passage of time. Going with orthodox Theravada, there's always a gap between each moment. That everything, including your mind, is flashing off and on, a trillion times a second. Minimum trillion times a second. And so, I mean, how do you explain it reappearing after a fraction of a trillionth of a second any better than it reappearing after 20 years? I mean, subjectively, it's the same. You're not going to be aware of any gap in between. So, partly it could be the karma of the other people around, and also it could be your karma that you're going to have a kind of sudden transition, that you're going to close your eyes in 1989 and open your eyes in 2005 due to some car crash that put you into a coma, or you just mixed the wrong pills at a party or some such. So it's not really any kind of like self-contradiction, as far as I can tell. It could be that you just have this karma that there's going to be a sudden shift. And so, I mean, outwardly, objectively, you had to be in a like stasis for 15 years or some such, but subjectively, there's just no gap at all. If you notice any kind of gap, then you weren't completely unconscious, because if you're completely unconscious, you're not going to notice anything. So I kind of answered that question. I'm going to move on to Siovaksha and Sipat Zirna's next question, which is, what's the difference between liminal and mystical? Well, they kind of have a different perspective. Mystical is experiencing reality directly without the intermediary of symbols, like perceptions. It is like going beyond perception and experiencing reality directly. Whereas liminal means sort of like an entryway or a window. It's sort of like an entrance. And so something that is liminal is sort of creating gaps between the rules, at least with regard to the way I use the word liminal. Like in The Trickster and the Paranormal, a book by George P. Hansen, he talks about liminality a lot. That's his explanation of the paranormal, is that there are certain cracks or gaps between the laws and the rules that give our world structure. It's kind of an artificial structure, and there are ways of increasing those gaps, and some people just have more gaps than others. Like a psychic, for example, is going to be more liminal than an ordinary person. The psychic isn't necessarily a mystic. They might be a little closer to being a mystic than Joe Schmo, the forklift driver or something. But still, I mean, it's like, how do I explain it? It's just the perspective is different. It's with regard to different aspects of what one is attempting to describe. So mystical is just sort of a metaphysical state, or a psychological metaphysical state, where you are experiencing reality without symbols. Whereas liminal is sort of, it's with regard to like gaps or entrances into this world or out of this world that could manifest as mysticism, or they could manifest as paranormal experiences, psychic powers, that kind of thing. But it is an interesting concept to me, liminality. A lot of people think that you couldn't possibly break the laws of physics, for example. Why? Well, that's just what the scientists say. That's what they assume. But really, like George P. Hansen explains, there's just sort of this artificial structure that gives a certain stability to our version of reality. Enough stability that it doesn't just disintegrate. But still, it's not 100% stable. If it were 100% stable, there might be no like real consciousness or anything. It would just be like pure determinism. So a certain amount of liminality, or just cracks between the rules, cracks between the laws, where this weirdness can seep in. I mean, that's my concept of liminality anyway. I'm sure that there are other possible definitions of liminal or liminality, but that's the one that I tend to go with. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Indiana Dhamma. And Indiana Dhamma says, this is a follow-up to my second question on the Atthakavagga. I have not found the advice of the Atthakavagga to be radical. I think it is probably the key to maximizing one's chance for Nibbana, yet so little of Dhamma practice in the East and the West seems geared toward eventually adopting the Atthakavagga's advice. If Nibbana is liberation from samsara, why not encourage the most radical approach? Exiting samsara is itself radical, since samsara is everything that is not Nibbana. There seems to be a typo in this question, because towards the top, Indiana Dhamma says, I have not found the advice of the Atthakavagga to be radical. And then towards the end, he's saying that why not encourage the most radical approach, even though he thinks the Atthakavagga does maximize your chances of enlightenment. So maybe I'm not exactly sure what he's trying to say with regard to that. But with regard to the Atthakavagga itself, it's just most people can't grasp it. So most people, including most monks, most Buddhists, most Buddhist philosophers, they're stuck in their head. They can't conceive of ever like just letting go of perception. Just stop attaching to perception. Stop having beliefs. That kind of thing. It's just they just can't do it. They're not ready for that yet. And so the Atthakavagga started off being very popular, but it faded into obscurity as Buddhism became more and more of a popular kind of a system, like a mainstream system, and normies just are not ready for the Atthakavagga. The Atthakavagga is death. It's scary. Have no beliefs. I mean, that's what we are, really. That's what our personality is just an accumulation of beliefs. Don't have habits. Well, the Atthakavagga doesn't really say don't have habits, but that would be part of it too. And that's pretty much what a character is like an accumulation of habits. So yeah, I think the Atthakavagga, with its idea of no view, no perception, no belief, and then it just takes for granted that the people who follow this are going to be homeless, ascetic mendicants wandering around with no home, sleeping under trees, wearing rags, begging for their food in the streets. That was how you do it in ancient India, and even Buddhist monks. The most Buddhist country in the world probably is Burma right now, and almost nobody is doing that because Buddhism converted into a kind of philosophical teaching, and the Burmese are very dogmatic, and so they just dedicate themselves to mastering this dogma, just memorizing all the definitions and the lists and all that, and practicing a kind of cookbook method of meditation that for the most part doesn't get them very far. And that's just the way people are. I mean, it's going to be a tiny minority that can really appreciate really advanced wisdom. So let's see. What is the actual question here? If Nibbana is liberation from samsara, why not encourage the most radical approach? Well, it depends on how you look at it. I mean, Buddhism is supposed to follow the middle path between extremes. So, I mean, you could call one of the extremes radical, or you could call both extremes radical, the radical self-torture and radical self-indulgence. in which case Buddhism would be like the least radical approach because it's the middle path between radical extremes. So maybe radical, especially because he seems to be using it in a self-contradictory way, where the first part of the question contradicts the second part of the question due to some typo that I'm not going to try and decipher. Yeah. So it depends on how you would determine radical. I mean, radical literally comes from root. The word radish means root. It's the same etymology as radical, radix. So, I mean, just getting to the root of reality, I guess, would be spiritually radical. And the Atthakavagga is about as radical of a text as there is in that regard. Some Mahayana Buddhist texts are comparable, like the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, for example, some Zen stuff, even like the Heart Sutra is pretty radical in the same kind of way, although the Heart Sutra is just more creating paradox, which blows your mind, whereas the Atthakavagga is just don't believe anything, no view, no perception, just wander around, sleeping under trees, begging for your food in the streets while being just sort of philosophically empty, so that you are not having reality obscured by these perceptual symbols. So it's essentially a mystical text or a mystical spiritual system where you're just trying to eliminate all these obscuring clouds of words and symbols and ideas just so that you can see reality directly, which is being obscured by all these clouds. So whether you want to call it radical or not, I guess would be a matter of personal taste. Let's see. So I guess the only question mark in this whole paragraph here is, if Nibbana is liberation from samsara, why not encourage the most radical approach? Well, part of it is just too scary and it's just too radical, if you want to call it that, because most people just aren't ready for it. And that includes most Buddhist monks, including most Buddhist philosophers who sort of help to codify and standardize Buddhist spirituality, Buddhist philosophy, so that it just kind of shifted away from this just direct approach, just plunging into the absolute, so to speak. And I guess I kind of answered that question, so it's time to move on to the next one. We don't have really a whole heck of a lot of questions this time. Maybe just slightly below average number of questions. So I don't think we're going to go for 3 hours. Besides, I'm not digressing nearly as much, except for that's exactly what I'm doing right now. Next question is from Kzen. And Kzen says, I have been on a Ramana Maharshi kick lately and have heard many stories of people that were essentially incapacitated for years after experiencing the self. Have you heard about this in the Buddhist side of things? And nothing comes to mind. I cannot recall. I mean, I may have come across a story like this where you've got somebody who just kind of gets jolted into a higher level of consciousness and they're incapacitated by it, like Ramana Maharshi was when he first had his jolt. Like Ramana Maharshi was mute for years after he had his realization. It was like it took him years to finally sort of find like some way of reconciling or integrating this higher level of consciousness with this kind of lowly, meat puppet level of existence, on the surface of the planet Earth. So, I mean, I haven't really come across that in Buddhism much, but I think one reason for that in Buddhism is that Buddhism is more of a unified system. Whereas Hinduism, it's just this broad spectrum of the ridiculous to the sublime. There's all these different strands of Hinduism going in different directions. And so it's more likely that you're going to kind of get off on a weird sidetrack or something. But then again, that didn't happen to Ramana Maharshi because he wasn't even particularly religious at the time that he had his sudden awakening. But I would guess that Buddhism being more like unified, like Theravada Buddhism especially, it's pretty streamlined. And if it's been, the bugs have been tested and everything, so you just follow it like the texts say you should follow it, or some dogmatic instructor instructs you to follow it, then you're not going to have much problem. Like in Hinduism, you got problems with uninitiated people who haven't purified themselves sufficiently, who are trying to do like advanced breath control or kundalini or things that are potentially dangerous. And then you can just get messed up by that kind of thing. Whereas in Theravada Buddhism, there's very, very little of that. So no, I haven't really heard about somebody just getting messed up through sort of straying into some esoteric state that they weren't ready for. I mean, you can have people that can crack up at meditation retreats. That happens quite a lot, actually. So that's kind of a lower level of somebody who they just crack from the strain of moving in slow motion and meditating all the time and not talking and sleeping only a few hours per night, this kind of thing. It's sort of like being in a thought reform camp, and they can just crack under the internal pressure of that. And also some people, they'll have weird experiences and start thinking that they're like an Arya or some such. So in a way they can become delusional as a result of meditative experiences. Some people that have like a tendency towards schizophrenia, for example. Yeah. Okay. I'm starting to recall a few cases now of someone who had a tendency towards schizophrenia. And then in meditation, they have some kind of elevating experience, some jolt happens to them in meditation, and they can just go off the deep end. They can insist they're fully enlightened, all this kind of stuff. In the book that I'm editing now, it's going to be my 4th book for publication, which I hope will be ready for publication by March. There is a case history of this German nun, who during a meditation retreat, all of a sudden just started believing herself to be fully enlightened. And she was just kind of wandering around, disheveled, giggling, and just behaving in a completely unhinged manner. So it can happen, but being incapacitated the way Kaizen is referring to, like Ramana Maharshi was, I've never really heard anything exactly like that. So I'm just going to move on to Kaizen's next question, which is similar to the first question. Also, do you suspect that there may have been U.S. citizens who have tripped into self-relaxation inadvertently, maybe he means realization, inadvertently, became incapacitated, but then were dealt with clinically in a way that obscures their realization in an outwardly sense? So I think what he's asking is, have people become enlightened or like had some sort of awakening experience and then just been institutionalized because they weren't acting normal anymore? That kind of thing can happen. Or it could be that people that are already kind of abnormal, they're liminal, like I was discussing earlier. They're kind of on the fringe or the verge of normality, so that weird things like enlightenment could happen to them more easily. They might be a combination. Like I was talking in previous Q&A, maybe the 2 previous Q&As, how like medieval saints, some of them had really high attainments, but at the same time, they were pretty nutty. George Fox is an example I've given, I think, the last 2 Q&As in a row, like the founder of the Quakers, who, I mean, he was kind of a nutty guy if you read his journals and that kind of thing. So there is that as a kind of complication. So it may be that someone who is kind of nutty to begin with, kind of has some kind of experience that makes them seem even more nutty. But even someone who is enlightened, they suddenly just go sane, so to speak. They could be viewed as insane. Like there's a movie called Fearless, which I highly recommend. And I can't remember the name of the actor. Jeff Bridges, I think. He has a near-death experience. He's in a plane crash, and he's one of the few survivors. But as the plane is in the process of crashing, before it hits the ground, he just sort of faces his imminent death and makes peace with that. And it just sort of, it's like a breakthrough. He becomes sort of like Eckhart Tolle. And after that, it's like things that he used to be afraid of or things that bothered him didn't bother him anymore. And he was like sort of compulsive truth teller. He wouldn't lie anymore. And people just thought there's something wrong with him, because he's not the old him. But this isn't the kind of stuff that Kaizen is talking about. That I assume there have been people like Ramana Maharshi in America who had some kind of realization, and then they just get sent to a mental hospital. They spend, years or the rest of their life in just kind of, in white jammies in this hospital. And maybe, the caretakers, the nurses and so forth, he might have been their favorite patient because he was so peaceful and kind and everything. But I maybe that they just had no idea that he was actually operating at a higher level of consciousness than them. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. I assume that something like that has happened before. But I don't know of any particular cases. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Hui Cheer. And Hui Cheer says, you are answering a question on subconscious mind. From what I understand in Buddhism, there is only one mind, as in one mind per person, and not a collective mind or hive mind. Anything else is the formation of the mind, like thought, ideas, concept, memories, etc. Therefore, the definition in Buddhism's mind and the mind in subconscious mind are different. Subconscious mind are more like suppressed memories, maybe, due to trauma or from past life karma. Hence, subconscious mind is karma related because it controls our emotion and action or volition. In the background, what are your thoughts? Okay, so I'll have to scroll up a little bit here. It says, so Hui Cheer says, from what he understands in Buddhism, there's only one mind, as in one mind per person, although in Buddhism there is no person. And not a collective mind or hive mind. Anything else is the formation of the mind, like thought, ideas, concept, memories. Well, no, I mean, what is called a mind in Buddhism? I mean, mind or it can have different meanings. It can just mean consciousness, like the word mano or the word chitta can just mean consciousness, like what would be called vijnana in Pali. But even that, it's not just one mind because it is flashing off and on a trillion times a second. It's a different mind from one moment to the next, much like a candle flame or like an electric current going through a wire is not exactly the same from one moment to the next. It's always changing. Different electrons, different photons, whatever it is, it's different from one moment to the next. So, also, I mean, like the mind is sort of like the body. The body is just an accumulation of parts, an accumulation of particles even. And the mind also, it's like every mental state, especially from the point of view of Abhidhamma, which is Orthodox Theravada, is like, it's like a conglomeration of these different elements constituting what a vulgar person would call the mind. So it's not just one thing. You might say there's one consciousness per moment. Yeah, that's fine. You want to say there's one consciousness per moment, but it's a different consciousness each moment, at least according to Orthodox Theravada and Buddhism in general. So let's see, the definition of in Buddhism's mind and the mind and subconscious mind are different. Well, the mind and subconscious mind, I mean, I'm not referring to just consciousness. I'm referring to just mental states, mentality in general, which has to be conscious. You can't have an unconscious mind. That mind, practically by definition, is going to be conscious. So the subconscious mind would be some of those particles, some of those strands of all this mentality going on that lie beyond this self-referential ego. You've got this self-referential ego, which is a system of like thoughts and beliefs and so forth that are aware. I mean, it's aware of what's under its own, lens, but there's other parts of mentality out there that are still conscious. It's just that they're not part of the ego. They're beyond the scope of the ego, at least temporarily. And I think people have a lot of difficulty making sense of the idea that there's mind beyond the ego. That they identify with their ego. Their ego is me, I am this. And it's the ego, which literally means I am in Latin, I'm pretty sure. And they just cannot comprehend that there could be any kind of mentality beyond the ego, because they just think the ego and the mind are synonymous. So you do have other levels of consciousness going on that are not within the scope of the conscious ego, which is really just a semi-conscious ego. It's not fully conscious. So, yeah, the subconscious mind, it's not so much like suppressed memories, because the memory doesn't exist until the conditions arise which cause the memory to arise. So, I mean, that's a lot of people have trouble with memories in Buddhism. If there is no self, where are the memories stored? But the mind just doesn't work that way, at least not from a Buddhist point of view. That the memories aren't stored anywhere. It just requires certain conditions to arise that causes that memory to arise. And then the memory ceases to arise when the conditions causing it to arise cease. But things like suppressed motives, like hysteria, people who are acting hysterically, who have motives that their ego isn't fully aware of, that there are motives like below the ego that are motivating a person's behavior, and their ego can't see those motives. You can deceive yourself. I used to think that, how could anybody deceive themselves? They'd have to know that they were deceiving themselves, because deception has to be deliberate. You can't accidentally lie. You have to lie on purpose. But then I started seeing people that were kind of hysterical people that were thinking that they were acting for a certain reason, when really it's pretty obvious that they had deeper reasons that they weren't aware of that were still motivating their behavior. Also, like dream symbolism, like just dreams in general are largely subconscious. But it's all consciousness, it's all mind. So I don't know if I answered Hui Chir's question or not, but I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Quasitor. And Quasitor says, does a newly conceived human being consider themselves to be that newly fertilized egg or zygote, or do they not form a new attachment to form until later on? Would they carry over the awareness they had from their previous life, assuming they were a human in their last life, and know where they are and what is happening to them, assuming they consider the forming embryo to be themselves? That's a pretty good question, I think. And I have read some stuff on this subject, not recently, but I have read it. And I think that this is kind of a weak point for Buddhism. There are certain things that Buddhism just doesn't explain very well. The subconscious mind that I was just discussing is one of them. Buddhism really can't explain that very well, at least not Orthodox Theravada and the Abhidhamma philosophy. This is another one. It's like, according to Buddhism, a human life begins at conception. That in order for a sperm to fertilize an egg, there also has to be some karmic stream ready to enter and be reborn, to undergo rebirth, linking consciousness right as that egg is being fertilized. And what that human, let's say it's a human being reborn as another human, what does that human mind, that human like mental momentum, the karmic stream, what does it do when it's just like this fertilized egg, and then it becomes just sort of dividing clump of cells? It goes through the different embryological stages, And there's not even a nervous system yet. So from the Buddhist point of view, I would assume that for the most part, you're like in a deep sleep during this time. It would be like Bhavanga Chitta, and which is just sort of like this, like a test pattern kind of a thing. It's just kind of the static mental state. But I have read books on, like life, like rebirth and so forth that weren't strictly Buddhist, just based in part upon, empirical case histories and like people who could recall their previous lives and this kind of thing, which you can take it for what it's worth. It's not really strictly scientific, but there are some people who claim, including some Hindu swamis that aren't as rigidly dogmatic as a Theravada Abhidhamma scholar. They can say that, you're sort of drifting in and out. Like some people will say that when you are an embryo, that your spirit is, for the most part, not in your mama's belly, but it's just doing, other stuff. It's going through, outside, other realm kind of stuff until the body is ready for you to start identifying with this curled up little baby inside your mama. Presumably, there'd have to be some kind of nervous system getting hooked up. So there is that. I mean, from the strictly Buddhist point of view, my best guess is that you would be considered to be like in a deep sleep while the embryo is developing into something complex enough that you can start thinking thoughts. Then again, it may be that in ancient India, they believed that even a tiny embryo can already think thoughts, because they apparently thought that a lot of animals have human intelligence. So why not an embryo? But I do think it's more likely, assuming that there is rebirth at the moment of conception, that your karma is going to be working itself out in other ways, in some like a bardo realm, some sort of intermediate realm, which Buddhism doesn't really accept. And the dogs are playing behind me. You guys stop it. Hey, don't. Yeah, she wants to play with me instead now. So where was I? So yeah, I mean, my best guess would be that it's not exactly the way the Buddhist texts explain it. In just a second. You guys stop it. Now they're going to go and roughhouse in the kitchen or something. So let's see. What exactly is the question? There's two question marks here. See, does a newly conceived human being consider themselves to be that newly fertilized egg? No, I don't think so. Unless they're sort of outside the mother, kind of looking in and thinking, yeah, that's what's going to be me. And then I won't remember this anymore because, it's like pushing a reset or something. Or do they not form a new attachment to form until later on? Yeah, I think the real attachments would come later on, at least with regard to that body. That any attachments before the embryo is developed would be, in some other realm that Theravada Buddhism doesn't really describe. So where's the other question mark? Let's see. Would they carry over the awareness they had from their previous life, and know where they are and what is happening to them, assuming they consider the forming embryo to be themselves? Theravada Buddhism really doesn't go over this kind of stuff very much. Ram Dass used to talk about this kind of stuff. He used to say, this is from a more Hindu perspective, that some babies, they take rebirth early on, not necessarily at conception, but very early on. And then some babies might not enter into the fetus until it's almost ready to be born. And then he said you can tell the difference between these two kind of babies, because the baby that's already just crying and squalling and behaving like a baby, that one's been inside of its mother for quite a while, presumably for the most part in a dreamy sleep state. Whereas the babies that are just kind of like stunned and zonked out, they're just kind of spaced out. Those are the ones that have just recently made the transition, and they didn't really enter the mother's womb until shortly before birth. That's like a more Hindu perspective. But considering that Buddhism doesn't really have much to say on the issue, that I do think it's fair game to be looking at different theories. I mean, it's always fair game to be looking at alternative ways of explaining things, because Theravada really does not have any kind of monopoly on wisdom, in my opinion. And there are certain things like the subconscious mind and exactly how rebirth happens, like what happens to your karmic stream, when the person you're going to be is still just a clump of cells, that kind of thing. It doesn't really do much to explain that sort of stuff. So my best guess is that you're not really going to be spending a lot of time, assuming you've got this psychic momentum, which is your karma, that is going to be reborn. And right now, the person you're going to be reborn as is still just a multiplying clump of cells. The mother is 2 weeks pregnant or something. Then for the most part, you're going to be in some other realm, sort of like what would be considered an intermediate kind of realm. And I mean, you could call it like a spirit realm or something, which would make it a little more orthodox, and maybe just sort of like commuting back and forth a little bit more and more as the baby becomes more developed, until finally the only other explanation would be that you'd be like in a deep sleep, kind of like in a comatose state or something, or an unconscious state, or just very, very minimal consciousness. But it's hard to explain what all of your karma is going to be doing, the psychic momentum, when it's in the form of a clump of cells, which is one reason why a lot of people have difficulty in the idea of rebirth as like a worm. How is all this complexity going to go into a worm? How's it going to fit in that worm? It's kind of similar. How is it going to fit in that embryo? So my best guesses would be heretical with regard to this stuff, because Orthodox Theravada doesn't do very much to explain it satisfactorily. So I'm just going to move on to Quasitor's next question. This is, referring to the example you give about the sniper with intention to kill and belief that he did kill versus the one that accidentally killed and didn't know it. Let's assume that the sniper will go to hell after death. Would they have the same experience and time in hell that they really killed that person? If so, the person actually being killed becomes irrelevant with regard to the killer's karma. Also, the person who accidentally killed someone and never finds out about it would have the same experience after death had they not killed them at all. Yeah, I mean, for the most part, I would say that is true, although there's also like a subconscious element, like at a deep level, our minds are all connected. So there could be a subliminal effect of messing with another person, even if you don't know that you're messing with that other person. Let's say, for example, let's give another example. You've got the guy sitting in a computer room launching cruise missiles. He's just some dude that works for the Navy or the Army or whatever. He's launching missiles, and he doesn't know exactly where those missiles are landing. Some of them are going to get shot down in midair and not hurt anybody. Some of them might blow up an entire hospital full of people. So it's like, let's say one guy shoots a missile and it doesn't kill anybody, but he doesn't know that. Another guy shoots a missile and it blows up a hospital. He doesn't know that either. So would they have exactly the same karma, assuming that all else is equal? I think at a superficial level, yes. But I do think that at a deeper level where there's like empathy and telepathy going on, where minds are connected, that deep down you may know, even though your conscious ego doesn't know, that you actually did kill people. That karma, your karma would be influenced by that. And it's the same case with someone who's not trying to launch explosives at somebody. They just shoot in the air and the bullet comes down and kills somebody a mile away, and they never hear about it. Or they might hear that somebody died suddenly or whatever. They never make the connection that they actually killed somebody even by accident. Then still at this subliminal level where minds are connected, there may be some awareness of what happened at a subconscious level. But Buddhism doesn't really discuss that, even though Buddhism does have cases similar to this, where, for example, if you are rude to an enlightened being, you're making much worse karma than if you're rude to an ordinary monk, for example. And the person who's rude doesn't have any clue that the person he's insulting is a fully enlightened being. He doesn't understand that. He's clueless. So how is it that you can go to hell for eons for mistreating an arahant when you wouldn't have received nearly that much of a karmic punishment, so to speak, if the person you were insulting wasn't an arahant and you have no clue? I mean, how could you know? So I do think in cases like that, Buddhism is just sort of glorifying its elite, so to speak. And there's a lot of this you can find in the text, how you're going to get just massive karmic rewards for supporting good monks, and you're going to get massive punishment for dissing good monks. So, I mean, from the beginning, to some degree, I think it was like Buddhist wise guys just trying to condition the populace into wanting to support them and being afraid not to support them. So I'm kind of skeptical of the idea of, there's the story I've told before of the rich man who had some leftovers given as alms to a Pacceka Buddha, and then afterwards he regretted it because he was stingy and thought, well, I could have just given it to the workers. And so he received karmic rewards, just massive. I mean, he spent eons in heaven for offering this alms food to the Pacceka Buddha, but then he also just received this very severe punishment. I can't remember if he went to hell or not. Also, heaven first and then hell or something, or whether it was something else, but he did receive serious punishment just as karmic retribution for having regretted it afterwards. And he'd had no idea that this person was an enlightened being that the alms were offered to. So how is that possible? And I'm personally kind of skeptical. I think it could happen that if you're going to, be rude to an enlightened being, that, I mean, at a subconscious level, again, it may be that you are aware of what you're doing. And so you're going to get, more serious karma for that. But I don't think it's quite as pronounced as some of the Pali texts would have us believe. And let's see, what was the question here anyway? Let's see, would they have the same experience and time in hell had they really killed that person? I do think that there is like a deeper subconscious level where minds are connected, where you may have this deeper subliminal awareness of what you did that might influence your karma. But that's about as far as it would go. So I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, do you think the ecstasies of art, architecture, the visual arts, music, film, literature are all wrong samadhi? So the ecstasies of art, I assume he means the ecstasies involved in the appreciation of art and not the production of art. First time I read this question, when I was cutting and pasting it onto the list here, I was thinking more of the point of view of the artist, that an artist who is absorbed in painting, for example, would you call that right samadhi, sama samadhi, or micha samadhi? Right concentration or wrong concentration. And it reminded me of one time I was in Indonesia and I met an artist, a relatively famous artist in Bali, who was telling me about how he'd like to practice meditation. He was very aesthetically oriented, which is suitable for an artist. And he just said he's never really gotten into meditation. He'd like to start meditating and being mindful, this kind of stuff. And I pointed out to him, like, I asked him, like, when you're painting, I mean, you're right there in the present moment, aren't you? You know, you're not thinking about other self. You're just right there, just dealing with, you know, colors and shapes and so forth. And he agreed. And I said, well, I mean, that's pretty much what you've got going for meditation right now, is when you're in this present moment, be here now when you're painting. But now that I think of it, Rui may be talking about appreciation, like somebody who's listening to a symphony that, you know, they're just really into that symphony. Would that be right concentration or wrong concentration? You know, they're just really just to the extent that you're in the present moment, then yeah, that would be right. I wouldn't say it's all black and white. I wouldn't say it's all right or all wrong. But if you're right there in the present moment, that's good, even though you're very much perceptual and it's like sensually pleasing as a general rule. Most great art is going to be sensually pleasing. So to some extent, you're like wallowing in sensuality, but at the same time, there is virtue in it. Just being right here, right now, in the present moment has its value. I mean, there's a certain meritoriousness to that. So I think, I mean, it would depend on the art also. Like, let's see, architecture, you're like in a cathedral or something, a Gothic cathedral. Yeah, I mean, that can really inspire ecstasy in some people, being in some medieval cathedral in France or something. Whether that would be, I really do think it's a shade of gray. In Buddhism, there's almost no just pure white and pure black. There's always shades of gray. And so it can be uplifting. It can be a more meritorious mental state than if you just walk into a Walmart. You know, you're uplifted to a certain degree. You know, your heart is open. I mean, that kind of stuff is good, even though it's not really the most conducive to enlightenment necessarily, and there will be a certain amount of wallowing in sensuality involved. I don't think people go into much ecstasies of art looking at like modern art that is deliberately ugly. So, yeah, I do think that it's just sort of a shade of gray, a complex, modeled shade of gray that will depend on one person, or, you know, it just depends on the individual. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, what survival skills, if any, did living in a cave require? I assume you made fires when it got cold and dug latrines for yourself at least, and no, I did not. Partly because it's against the rules of monastic discipline to build a fire to keep yourself warm unless you're like sick. And in central Burma, it really doesn't get that cold anyway. You know, it's easily survivable. So I did make fires for the sake of burning garbage, because you get a lot of plastic wrappers and that kind of thing when you go for alms sometimes. And I did make fires for heating coffee water. But you're not supposed to make fires to warm yourself unless it's like below freezing and you're gonna die of hypothermia or get frostbite or something if you don't build a fire. With regard to digging latrines, that's against the rules of monastic discipline. Also, digging in the ground is against the rules for monks, because you're going to be cutting through little worms and stuff when you're digging the ground. So you're not supposed to do that either. So I would just, if I moved to a different place, there wasn't an outhouse there, I'd just crap on the ground until some generous, good-hearted villagers would offer to make me a latrine. That happened before. So survival skills, living in a cave. I mean, just knowing the survival skills of like the habits of certain dangerous animals like snakes, the ability to differentiate a venomous snake from a harmless snake. That would come in handy. That would be a valuable survival skill. There was the one cave that I lived in where they had to dig me the latrine. I learned the survival skill of how to purify water. Like during the rainy season, the river or the stream there was just brown. It was like flood water. You couldn't drink it. You get diarrhea if you drank that water. But what you do is just with your hands or with a bowl lid or something, you scoop out like a crater, a big bowl-shaped basin in the sand near the creek or near the pond, wherever the water is. You just dig out this basin in the sand, let it fill up, bail the water out, generally with your bowl lid or a bath cup or something. Let it fill up, bail it out again, and just keep doing that until the water is clear, and then you can drink the water safely. That was like one of my most valuable camping skills that I had to do living in caves. That and being able to know the habits of like wasps and snakes and so forth. But I didn't really need very many other survival skills. Not that I can think of anyway. So I'll just move on to Philalethes' next question, which is, what's the closest you got to feeling like Indiana Jones out in the sticks? So Indiana Jones was like an archaeologist. So I guess the closest I got to feeling like an archaeologist when I was in Burma was the first time I went to Bhagwan, which used to be the capital of Burma like 1,000 years ago. And they hadn't started renovating the temples yet. The government eventually got this dumb idea that tourists would be much more interested in going to see renovated temples than ruins. So back in the 90s, when I first went to Bhagwan, it was still lots of ruins. And you could see out in a farmer's field, there'd be this ruined temple just standing out in a farmer's field. And you go out there and you go inside and there'd be like the remnants of murals on the walls. There'd still be a Buddha statue. His belly would be ripped out. It was probably ripped out hundreds of years ago by people looking for treasure, because sometimes like a certain amount of treasure would be enshrined in this shrine. And apparently in Bhagwan, they were putting it in the belly of the Buddha because there were a lot of Buddha statues that just had their bellies missing. They'd still be sitting there in serene meditation. And, you know, it's like they'd be disemboweled. And those are some of my favorite temples, just sort of like the smaller ones that nobody had bothered to, you know, maintain or anything. They were just kind of abandoned. So that sort of thing made me feel kind of like an archaeologist. With regard to just the adventure aspect of Indiana Jones, one time I did make a raft down Patolone Creek and quite a few miles down the Chindwin River on this raft. I used to stay at Alondo Kathapa National Park for a hot season. I spent a number of hot seasons there. And I'd leave when the rain started, usually, like when the monsoon started. And when the monsoon started, almost the only way out of that area was hiking through the forest to get to the nearest road, which was like 16 miles usually, depending on roads getting washed out. One time it was like more than 30 miles that had to be traversed before you could get to an actual road. And it was just horseflies. It was just awful. It was terrible. Horseflies everywhere, and they're attracted to moisture. And me being this foreigner whose ancestors evolved to survive ice ages, I would just be drenched in sweat. The villagers who would be accompanying me would be fine because they wouldn't be sweating as much as me. The horseflies would just be attracted to me. I'd have to have like the sweat wiping rag in constant motion, keeping them off of me. So one year I decided I'm gonna be intelligent this year, and I'm gonna take a raft and ride the raft out to the river, so I won't have to be hiking through the forest with all the horseflies. And so I actually brought with me that year 2 big truck inner tubes, and I blew them up. I had like a little bicycle pump that I pumped up the inner tubes, and then I made this frame of like bamboo poles over the top of that for like a frame. And then there was like a teak wood plank that was used for a seat, and some nice village guys carved me a paddle, like a kayak paddle with an oar or like a blade at each end. It was all solid teak too. It was nice. And so I'm like going down the rapids on this inner tube raft. It was not a very well designed raft. I mean, it kept me above the water. You know, it floated, but unlike a canoe, a raft like that made out of inner tubes, it stops moving forwards as soon as you stop paddling. You know, that you can't really get some good momentum going. You can't really coast or glide through the water like you could with like a streamlined canoe. But there was, especially right before I got to the river, it was like the most whitewater rafting I ever did. And then I got out onto the river, and it's a big flooded river. You know, it looked like it was about a mile across. Probably not that much, but at least half a mile probably. And man, that's the closest I ever felt to being like an insect. Sometimes you see like some tiny beetle wandering across like this expanse of concrete, you know, and it seems so fearless just in this hostile world. I felt like that in that little raft, which was, you know, not much bigger than I was, in the middle of the Chindwin River at the beginning of the monsoon season. And there's like big river boats going up and down up the river, and there's like a storm brewing behind me. The wind was blowing, you know, the storm closer to me, just like black sky. And I just felt like a bug at that time, just like that little beetle wandering across the pavement. Just this tiny speck that just surrounded by this hostile universe. Maybe someday that'll get published. I did kind of keep a journal going at that time. But that would be, with regard to adventure, that was probably my biggest adventure. That and just the yearly hike through Alondo Kathapa National Park, always barefoot. So I guess that would be it. And I'm just going to move on to Phil Lathy's third question, which is, were there any or many British colonial remnants in Burma? I always think of that one Kipling poem, Mandalay. Yeah, there's not a whole lot of British colonial remnants. Like in Rangoon, there's still a lot of buildings, like old government buildings from British times. You know, throughout Burma, you can find, you know, old buildings, like the trains and the riverboats at the time that I was living in Burma were almost all remnants from the British Empire. That the Burmese government just never got around to making new or buying new trains and new riverboats. And some of those trains, it was just one train that I rode in Burma. It was like being on a galloping horse. It was just like bouncing down the tracks the whole way. It's left over from British times. The topographical maps, the best maps in Burma, were made by the British during the British Empire. And then also there's one place, I can't remember the name. I can't remember the name of this place. It's right next to Po Windown in northwestern Burma. It's one of my favorite places to go in Burma. Po Windown, I mean. And it's like a medieval complex of cave temples. Just hundreds and hundreds of these cave temples carved into the side of the hills. So that's nice, but I especially like it because there's troops of scroungy monkeys, and I just love feeding monkeys. So I'd go there with big bags of like fruit and stuff and feed the monkeys. But there's a place right next to that, and I bought something down. I can't remember the name of it, but it's an easy walk from Po Windown, which is, it's like this big sandstone hill that like a village of temples has been carved into the solid rock. And you go down the steps, and there's like these narrow avenues with just kind of lined with shrines carved into the rock. And there's one in particular that it's one of the bigger ones of these shrines. It's got like the imperial crown, the British imperial crown included in the architrave of the temple, sort of like the facade across the top, that it had like a peacock and stuff. And also there was like the British imperial crown there. So they were sort of kissing some imperial butt by including that on their temple wall. But yeah, I mean, there are vestiges. There seems to be more vestiges of British colonial, like the Raj in Burma, than you're going to find like in Bali. And finding remnants of the Dutch government there is I can't remember seeing anything. Maybe than just a few old buildings. So let's see. I think I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liberlam, and sometimes still known as Liberlam, I have to admit. And his first question is, what's the karma of being a mall Santa? And being a mall Santa, it would be somewhat like being an actor. In Theravada Buddhism, in the suttas, you will see the Buddha saying that actors are going to go to hell. And I don't think all actors are going to go to hell. I mean, throughout history, actors have tended to be moral degenerates. I mean, there's like a statistically significant increase in the likelihood of someone being a moral degenerate if they are an actor. Like in ancient Rome, actors were infamia. They weren't considered to be full citizens. They were down with chariot drivers and gladiators and that sort of thing. Like in Shakespeare's time, women were not allowed to act on stage. That's why there are relatively few women in Shakespeare plays, and they were all played by prepubescent boys, because, actresses were just notoriously immoral. They just made a law preventing actresses from existing in Elizabethan England. Throughout the Middle Ages, actors and actresses, they were sort of infamia even long after the time of the Roman Empire. Like a lot of places, actresses and actors they couldn't receive the benefit of the church. They couldn't be married. They couldn't be buried in a sanctified church ground, anything like that. So there is that. And I think from the Buddhist point of view, though, it's not so much the moral degeneracy of being an actor. It's like the karma of creating a false reality, more false than this so-called normal reality. Even this isn't ultimately real, but what an actor does, or a mall Santa, is like promoting a version of reality that's false even by like the level of conventional truth. So in a way, it's sort of subverting the youth of the country by, promoting, impersonating some Anatolian saint from the late Roman Empire. So, they do make people happy. And again, it's going to be a shade of gray. It's going to be a karmic mix of meritorious and demeritorious. But from a Buddhist point of view, being a mall Santa, you are deceiving children, literally. They think that you're someone that you are pretending to be, but aren't. And you're promoting like this false reality. In a way, you're contributing to the delusion of children. So, even if there is a real Santa out there, you're not it if you're a mall Santa. So you're like an imposter. So I don't think that you're going to that mall Santas are all going to go to hell, but I don't think that it's particularly meritorious. There's worse things you could do, but being a mall Santa, it's a shade of gray, and it's going to have some good points and some bad points. But it would not be encouraged from a Buddhist point of view, even setting aside the whole idea that Christmas is a Christian holiday and Buddhism just isn't really into that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Stellar Supreme, formerly and sometimes still known as Liberlam. How would you rank the German chocolate you got for Christmas in relation to other kinds of chocolate you've tried? Well, it was all right. I mean, I'm not going to complain against it. I'm certainly eating all of it, although it's a little sweeter than I would consider optimal. The best, like if I had to eat only one kind of chocolate for the rest of my life, I would probably go for Ghirardelli 86% cacao. Ghirardelli is good chocolate, and 86% cacao seems to be about right for me. So I think I'll move on to the next question now. This is from Scoladin or Sculadine. And let's check here. Yeah, only an hour and a half. We're just motoring right along here. Scoladin or Sculadine says, if you could increase the viewer's knowledge by one book for the following year, what would you choose? So I assume what he means is if I could have my viewers read one book, what book would I have them read? And apparently I have to just go one size fits all. I couldn't just tailor the book to the individual. But I mean, if I had everybody read just one book, I'd just, read the Sutta Nipata. That's a good book to read. I think a lot of my viewers have already read the Sutta Nipata, though. But in that case, just read it again. That would be it, I suppose. I mean, if it couldn't be something like that, then The Trickster and the Paranormal by George P. Hansen, that I continually harp away at, is also a good one. My friend Otto sent me a copy of that book, so the credit goes to Otto for that one. Also, he's the one who sent me the Book of the New Sun, and The Trickster and the Paranormal and the Book of the New Sun are like the two books by Otto that I have read from cover to cover, and they're two of my favorite books. So Otto Excelsior has excellent taste in books, and I should read more of the books that he has sent to me, but I just don't read books very much at all anymore. So I'm just going to move on to Scoladin or Sculadine's next question, which is, would you kindly make some predictions for the new year? And predictions for the new year, man, I do hope that America will do better this year than it has during the Biden regime. I think there is a good chance that Trump's second term is going to be damned interesting, that he's really going to be upsetting apple carts, or at least trying his best. And I do think that the so-called swamp, the establishment is, in a way, they sense their own defeat. They're not trying nearly as hard. They're not nearly as hysterical now as they were in 2016, the first time Trump won. So I do think that there is a possibility that the second Trump administration is going to really shake things up and just start breaking old corrupt systems, and are doing more to break up old corrupt systems than has been done in a very long time, possibly since Theodore Roosevelt. I do hope that he and Elon Musk will continue to get along and won't start feuding, which is kind of because of the whole H-1B visa thing, that I think Elon Musk has partly because he's a multi-billionaire, he's an autist, and also he has this newfound power to influence society that in a way it's gone to his head, and he's going Nero. He's threatening to wage war against MAGA and all this kind of stuff now if he can't get cheap Indian labor to work for his tech companies. So there is a possibility of that, but I'm not really predicting much. I just think it's going to be, my main prediction is going to be damned interesting. And I do think that Western civilization is going to be lurching a bit more towards the right and more towards populism and away from just this globalist woke bullshit that is just insane. So, yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of upheaval, which I think in the long run is going to be good upheaval. With regard to like wars and rumors of wars and so forth, I think Trump in office is going to damp down a lot of the global threats. I think China will be less, they'll be threatening to invade Taiwan less. I think Hamas is going to collapse a little faster. I think like the whole Russia-Ukraine thing is probably going to be negotiated to a peace under Trump, probably. But yeah, I'm not really feeling very prophetic. You know, I'm not having any visions. I'm not downloading any visions at present, and so I can't really make predictions other than mainly there's going to be a lot of upheaval, and it's going to be damned interesting. So I'm just going to move on to Skuladin or Skuladine's next question, which is kind of a strange question. He says, from the various answers over this year, have I drifted off course in understanding them? And then he's got these bullet points. Mind is chief. Mind is the forerunner. Nowhere in that verse does it mention oceans. The last person is greater than one wisdom. One wisdom equals free of delusion. That doesn't make sense to me. The layperson is greater than one wisdom, and one wisdom equals free of delusion. So the layperson is greater than free of delusion, which doesn't make sense to me. But I'll continue here. There is no self. Self is delusional. The self is the wall. Great album. Well, with regard to that one, the wall, like the Pink Floyd's wall, would be a rather serious manifestation of the self. But it wouldn't be limited. I mean, the self wouldn't be limited to Pink Floyd's wall. Just the very idea that you exist is already a self, kind of self view, anyways. And something like Pink Floyd's wall is like rather severe alienation. Although, I mean, you can refer to the self or the ego as kind of Pink Floyd's wall, and that you have to just completely knock it down so that there's no boundary. So if you have a self, there would presumably be a boundary to that self. There'd be self as opposed to other. If there is no other, then self itself loses all meaning, which is something to consider for those people who believe in a self, especially if they're Buddhists. So, okay, I'll just continue here. The delusional mind reifies the wall. To experience Nibbana, the wall needs to be breached. Breaching the wall can be as fast as opening a window, or as a long, arduous process like breaking out of prison with a spoon. Although you do not exist, your actions are real enough because they affect the mind, like the assets of those plastic Asian web girls who keep getting conspicuously consumed. I don't understand that one. I mean, plastic Asian web girls, I understand. They're all the filters and stuff that make them look plastic. And some of them are just AI, and it's some fat guy in his underwear that's just producing these Asian web girls. But they keep getting conspicuously consumed. I don't understand that one necessarily. And then, so be here now, be happy. I'll just scroll back up to the question here. From the various answers over this year, have I drifted off course in understanding them? Well, I'd have to know what your understanding is of all these issues. You give little hints, and I did address a few of those hints. See, mind is chief, yeah. Mind is the forerunner. Nowhere in that verse does it mention oceans. Yeah, that's all from Dhammapada verse 1. And the layperson is greater than one wisdom. I don't understand that one. Especially when one wisdom equals free of delusion. Yeah, I don't understand that part. There is no self. Yeah, that's I'd say that's right. At least at the ultimate level, if the ultimate can be said to have a level. Self is delusional. Yeah, that's the root of all delusion, is the conceit I am. Let's see. The delusional mind reifies, the self is the wall. Yeah, I already discussed that a little bit. The delusional mind reifies the wall. Yeah, that's true. To experience Nibbana, the wall needs to be breached or transcended. I mean, you don't necessarily have to destroy the thing. You just have to render it irrelevant. Breaching the wall can be as fast as opening a window or as a long, arduous process. Yeah, I'd go with that. Just assuming that at the level of samsara there even is enlightenment. Let's see. Your actions are real enough because they affect the mind. Yeah. Yeah, they are ultimately mental. Okay, yeah, well, it seems like Skaladin is doing fairly well, as far as I can tell, although I really can't say if he has drifted off course in understanding them any beyond just these little hints that he has given. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, in your opinion, what are the top 3 best and worst countries to ordain as a monk? And somebody already attempted to answer this question in the comments under the YouTube video, and my answer would be not so different. I mean, North Korea immediately comes to mind as not a good country to be ordained as a monk. Some radical fundamentalist Islamic country, maybe Syria nowadays, or Saudi Arabia, or Afghanistan maybe. And then there's like sub-Saharan African nations that are just in a state of just chronic upheaval and corruption and coups and overthrows and massacres and all this kind of stuff. Nigeria maybe. Yeah, I assume there are safe places in Nigeria. It's just that you don't hear about them in the news. But it's not a place where I would want to be ordained as a monk. So, I mean, you could take your pick of just the most repressive or just unstable, chaotic countries to be ordained as, just take your pick of 3, and those would be the 3 worst ones. I think North Korea would make it onto most lists. The 3 best countries to ordain as a monk, well, with regard to Burma, it depends on the political situation. So let's say Burma is not best because of the political situation, even though it's the most Theravadan country in the world. So you still got Thailand, you got Sri Lanka, and let's say 3rd, Cambodia maybe. Cambodia, or possibly even Bali. There are a number of Theravada Buddhist monasteries in Bali. Bali's a nice place, and you can go for alms round in Bali too, so that's nice. Even someplace like America isn't bad. The main problems with being ordained in America, first of all, it's not a Buddhist culture, so you're dealing with irreverent Westerners who just consider you to be another guy who just dresses funny. Also, it's more difficult to live like the texts say a monk should live, wandering homeless, sleeping under trees, that kind of stuff. It's possible, but not very doable in general in America, especially in the wintertime. So probably the 3 best countries to be ordained as a monk would be Theravada Buddhist countries in tropical or at least subtropical Asia. So Thailand, Sri Lanka, and if not Burma, then let's say Cambodia. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And PSA says, if you could go back in time to your last year as a monk, would you choose to disrobe again? Well, yeah, I think I reached the point of no return around 2018. That really my last reasonable, plausible chance at remaining a monk for the rest of my life was when I was still in Burma, and I volunteered to become the resident abbot of a monastery in the foothills of the Shan Plateau called Mygadawon in Yechan-O village, Cold Water Pot village. And the abbot there, who was getting old and wanted to find a replacement, he liked me, and that monastery was set up for Western monks in the Tongpulu tradition. I was the only one left in Burma, so I was the obvious choice. But he was too embarrassed. In Burmese, it's called anade. He didn't want to admit that even before I made the offer, he had already said yes to this young scholar monk who was going to turn the place into a school monastery. But if he had allowed me to become the resident abbot of Mygadawon Monastery on the outskirts of Yechan-o village in Burma, then there's a good chance I'd still be a monk today. But that didn't happen. I came back to America in late 2018, if I remember correctly. And I mean, if I could go back in time to my last year as a monk, I mean, I might disrobe sooner instead of waiting as long as I did. Because really, it just wasn't working out very well in America for various reasons. Just the main problem was just living in a Burmese temple. It was in the Tongpulu tradition in which I was ordained, and the abbot was one of my early teachers who participated in my ordination ceremony. But the Burmese, as a general rule, just are not very strict. It was very lax. The atmosphere was not conducive to like serious, sincere practice, and it just wasn't working. And I'd already tried being like a free range monk, just living among Westerners. That didn't work out so well either. And so I just kind of lost my momentum, lost my inspiration to remain a monk. It just had stopped serving me for the most part. And that started like more than a year before I dropped out. So if I could go back in time to my last year as a monk, if anything, I would have dropped out even sooner. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And the Xenothoid says, there is data to suggest that the older someone who is susceptible to Alzheimer's and dementia works past retirement age, the longer it takes for them to experience the symptoms of senility. Do you believe monastics may be more susceptible to senility because they do not have jobs? Well, the regular meditators are not particularly susceptible to senility. That meditation keeps you alert. And so meditation, it also keeps you healthy. Like when I was meditating, doing regular sitting practice as a monk, and I'd sit several hours a day for years and years, I had more resistance to like common colds and that sort of thing also. I think partly is you start noticing like an imbalance in the system right when it's starting because you're so sort of in tune and your senses are more subtle so that you can sort of catch it and just kind of will or whatever it is, your mind just kind of steers you away from it somehow. Something like that. Or your mind is just more balanced and so your body is more balanced because mind and body are connected. Mind is the forerunner, mind is chief. So you've got a mind that's just clear and bright and subtle and quiet and everything. It just helps your whole system to be healthier. Unless you have a real karmic need for something to go kasplooey. So monks that just sit around and listen to the radio and drink tea and smoke cigars and hang out with old village guys, they might become senile, relatively easily. But the serious practitioners who are, ardently, vigilantly observing the sensation of touch at their nostrils as the air goes in and out for several hours a day, I think their mind is healthy, and so it helps to keep their body and their brain healthy. I really had very little, I didn't have a whole lot of contact with senile old monks, and the ones that were senile old monks, for the most part, didn't meditate much, if at all. So I think I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's next question. Do you believe the act of meditation preserves the mental strength to ward off senility? Well, I kind of already answered that one. Yeah, I do think so. And it wards off other things besides senility, like other health problems it can ward off also. Although you have to be careful to kind of keep a balance going. If your meditation is kind of extreme, you're pushing yourself out of kilter through your meditation practice by like trying too hard or something, that can mess up your health also. So you have to like be awake and aware enough to know what is the good middle balance, and just it really does. It is helpful in being healthy in general. So I think I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's third question. Do you think monastics would benefit from still doing mental workouts, perhaps something like complex math, in order to keep their minds strong, or would this be unadvisable because of the potential to become attached to such intellectual pursuits? Well, personally, for myself, I do think that it is good to exercise your brain. Your brain is like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the healthier and stronger it is likely to be. So, I mean, doing Sudokus is, it's just like a mental exercise. It's not like you're actually gaining anything by solving an evil Sudoku, but it's just a good, like a brain workout. And I do get a certain satisfaction from doing Sudokus, especially evil ones. So, yeah, I do think that it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think maybe for like a devout monk who thinks that anything worldly like a Sudoku is something to be avoided, at least they can try and figure out or just like study the texts and try to understand like difficult ideas in Buddhist philosophy. That kind of thing would have a similar effect. But I mean, think if you're just following the Atthakavagga, wandering around homeless and, dressing in rags and begging for food in the streets and just not believing anything, just keeping your mind clear and wide open, I don't think you're going to have any problems with that either. Other than maybe getting attacked by bandits or tigers or something. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, my question is about the similarities and differences between the meditation methods practiced among mystics of the major faiths. You often mention Christian mystics like St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila in your Q&As. I was wondering if you can break down the specific similarities and differences between the contemplative meditation methods that Christians like them practiced versus the meditation practiced in Buddhism. For example, the method of observing and letting go of the arising and passing of thoughts and physical sensations in Satipatthana. Is this what the Sufis in Islam, Hindus, or Christian mystics do as well? Well, I'm no authority on Sufis, how the Sufis meditate, and even Hindus. I mean, I'm familiar with certain Hindu meditation techniques, but the really advanced ones that are beyond mantra, that kind of thing, I'm not really an expert on advanced Hindu meditation techniques. I mainly have just done Buddhist meditation. But I have read, like in St. John of the Cross, he explains very well how a Christian contemplative would practice meditation and contemplation. And so when you get past meditation, with regard to meditation, which is you're still thinking, you still have mental images going, the Christian ones are you're visualizing events in the life of Christ, for example, or you're repeating a kind of mantra, like the Jesus prayer, dear God, please have mercy upon me, a sinner, over and over again, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think that it's generally not quite as advanced of a meditation method as in Buddhism when you're still thinking, especially if you're just thinking, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, or using a very simple mantra like Buddha in like Thailand. That's probably the most common mantra. So, but when you get into contemplation, which is you're not thinking anymore, then to some degree, the Christians may actually have the advantage, because the Buddhists, it's just an aspect of Buddhist philosophy that you cannot have consciousness without perception. If you're going to be conscious, you got to be perceiving something. And so they can't really practice very well the practice of just getting rid of all perception. Even though in the Atthakavagga it says have no perception, still Buddhist philosophy developed to the idea that you cannot be conscious without perception. And so the idea of like St. John of the Cross doesn't work, because it's, in a way, it's sort of a handicap in Buddhist philosophy, this idea that you cannot get rid of perception. You cannot have pure consciousness without perception. Whereas St. John of the Cross, his method of contemplation is dismiss anything from your mind that is not God. And so you cannot understand God through the intellect, dismiss the intellect. You can't understand or know God through your emotions, dismiss the emotions. You can't sense God with your sense organs, dismiss the senses. You just dismiss all mental states, because no mental state can contain God until you're just empty. And then still there's something there. And that's like the divine insight. That's dark faith. You realize the Spirit of God is still there. You've dismissed everything that can be dismissed, and still there's this presence, so to speak. It's just formless, and you can't grasp it. It has no form, but still it's there, and you know that it's there. Whereas in Buddhism, you just get more and more and more and more subtle. The perceptions just become more and more and more and more subtle. And there's not even, you'd be a heretic to want to get rid of all perception and remain conscious. It may be the perceptionless Brahmas were not like statues, like the later commentarial tradition declared them to be, because maybe in early Buddhism, apparently, that you could be conscious without perceptions. But it is now considered to be unorthodox. It's wrong view. It's heretical to think that you can have consciousness without perception and other mental states like volition. So let's see. The result is essentially the same, but it's the way they went about it is slightly different. Because in Buddhism, you start with a primary object. And then the primary object just becomes more and more subtle until, you get as far with it as you possibly can. Whereas somebody like St. John of the Cross is just dismiss the primary object. Just dismiss, get rid of all of it. So that would be the main difference, although the results are essentially very similar. They're getting into the same kind of mental states or the same kind of levels of consciousness. And I think both of them may be conducive to enlightenment. If you're an adept, if you are blessed with just being ripe for it. You're like the yellow leaf that all you got to do is just touch it and it falls away from the tree. So let's see, what exactly is the question here? My question is about the similarities and differences between the meditation methods practiced among mystics of the major faiths. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm really no authority on Sufi meditation. I did meet a Sufi meditator once. Almost the only thing I can remember about his meditation was that he would meditate with his eyes open instead of closed. But then some Zen Buddhists do that. I used to meditate with my eyes open instead of closed. When I was in a cave in Burma a lot of the time, partly because it's like the mental energy involved in seeing. If your eyes are closed, that mental energy is still just kind of knocking around looking for something to do. Whereas if you keep your eyes open, even if you're staring at a blank wall, just the vision of seeing a blank wall still is using that energy, which is sort of getting some of that energy out of your mind, which otherwise might be used to just wander around or get into trouble. So, yeah, even Hindu meditation, the Hindus are more into samatha than the Buddhists. There are some smug Buddhists who will say the Hindus only do samatha, they have no vipassana, but I don't think so. Because vipassana is insight which can arise spontaneously. Even if you're not trying to cultivate it, it can still arise. So I think the Hindus take the path of just more and more and more purification, more and more subtlety. Whereas in Buddhism, once you hit the minimum necessary amount of subtlety, or the maximum level of subtlety, once you get to an adequate level of subtlety, you can just bail out sideways. Whereas the Hindus have this idea of you just keep following the path and following the path, no bailing out sideways. You just keep following it until you get to the end, but there is no end. You can just keep following a path and just increasing subtlety, forever. So, of the two ways of doing higher meditation practices, contemplation that I know of, which is contemplative Roman Catholics like the discalced Carmelites and Theravada Buddhism. They're similar. I mean, it's the ways they go about it, even mindfulness. I mean, St. John of the Cross had his own kind of mindfulness. The Catholics call it recollection, which is kind of strange because in recollection can mean memory. Also, the Pali word sati, which is translated as mindfulness, also means memory. But it's like you're not remembering anything because you're right in the present moment. It's like you're destroying the past and the present. Or the past and the future, I mean. You're just right there in the present moment. So that was a practice for Catholics and for Buddhists. More Buddhists than Catholics, I think. You had to be in one of these contemplative orders, I think, in order to be taught this stuff. So, I mean, the practices between the discalced Carmelites of the late 16th century Spain and Theravada Buddhists, they're in a lot of ways they're more similar than different. I mean, they just happen to converge. It's like convergent evolution. But I'm not sure exactly how well I answered that question. And I'm not going to answer any better because I'm moving on to the next question, which is from Cherzaskaz's. And Cherzaskaz, he asked this question that I didn't understand at first. It comes out, English is not his native language. He's a barbarian who lives in one of those countries that does not have English as its primary language. And so he says, I felt severe existence pain and everything seems to be good. What should I do? And then I didn't ask him, what does I felt severe existence pain mean? And he says, it is psychological, not physical. I feel bad that I exist and had in the past a few attempts, so to speak. You can call it vibhava tanha, or desire for non-existence. While others have life plans and ambitions and aspirations, my life is really waiting for the end. So when he said, I felt severe existence pain, I think what he means is, I feel severe existential pain. He's got existential dukkha. He says his life seems to be good. Probably has a good woman who loves him. What should he do? Well, I mean, for starters, just try to understand it. I mean, that would be number one, I think. Observe it. Observe it like an ichthyologist observes a dead fish. Be mindful of it. And, I mean, the more you observe it, and I mean, not just wallowing in it or feeling it, but really observing it objectively and trying to understand what it's like, what it feels like. What effect does it have on your body? What effect does it have on your emotions? What effect does it have on your intellect? Just observe it like a scientist kind of, and try to understand it. And don't necessarily try to figure it out. Just keep observing it and observing it until an insight arises spontaneously that will help you to understand it. I mean, it could be that you're just sensitive to the first noble truth, which is to exist is dukkha. And it may be that there's like karmic holdovers from previous existences when maybe you were some sort of anti-worldly ascetic type. And that could, everything seems to be good, partly because of the merit you earned as this anti-worldly ascetic type. But let's see here. He feels bad that he exists and had in the past a few attempts, so to speak. Well, I mean, you have to, the way to be happy is just to accept the way things are. And so if you have these feelings, you should accept those too. You shouldn't be against your againstness, because that's just sort of complicated dukkha, just making things worse. So, when you have these feelings arise, you're alive now, you're going to be dead after you die. There's no need to hurry it up, because there's obviously things you have to learn while you're still alive. So, you should make use of your life wisely and try to understand what arises if you can. I mean, not try to figure it out cerebrally, but just observe it carefully. And then when you've observed enough that you're going to start getting insights, you probably already have to some degree. So just be patient and understand, or just be mindful of these feelings that arise. And when you're ready to understand why it's that way, then you will. But until then, you just keep collecting data, so to speak, through mindful observation. And be patient. Just accept the way things are. And if you have these feelings of existential pain, just observe those the way you would observe like an itch or something. Whatever arises, the wind blowing on your skin, you observe that. Existential pain, you observe that. You feel hungry, you observe that. You have an urge to eat pasta, you observe that. Just whatever arises, including existential pain, you observe it mindfully. And it just helps. And also, in addition to increasing the odds of the necessary insight arising, also it just reduces the momentum of it. It's like you're gradually neutralizing the karma of that. And I mean, pain from the Buddhist point of view is something that you're better off neutralizing rather than just wallowing in it. I mean, having aversion for pain, that's kind of one extreme. And then just like wallowing in it, that'd be, or having aversion for pleasure, that would, there's like the middle path. You shouldn't be wallowing in anything really. But I think I'm starting to ramble. But good luck to you. You seem to be a good person. So just be mindful. Just observe it. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Ecstasies. And Ecstasies says, do people eat dogs in Burma? And I've heard about people eating dogs in Burma. It's mostly like poor villagers who are ignorant and think that eating dog meat will cure them of malaria. That it's sort of like this folk remedy for malaria, that some people will eat dog meat as in an attempt to cure them of malaria. Also, I've heard the Karens eat dog. That I had the same abbot that almost appointed me the next abbot, or kind of was sort of almost going to appoint me the next abbot of his monastery. There was a convent of, they were Franciscan nuns that lived about a mile away. And he had these puppies he wanted to get rid of. The Franciscan nuns, who were on friendly terms with him, said that they'd take the puppies, and the abbot said, well, there's a lot of Karen nuns there, they might eat them. And I'm telling him, Bhante, I mean, they're Christian nuns, they're not going to be asked, taking these dogs in order to eat them. So there are certain ethnicities in which eating dogs may be more common than other ethnicities. And there's like the folklore, the folk medicine believed in by generally the most ignorant people. Most Burmese people know that you're not going to get cured of malaria by eating dog meat. And then there's just some who are very poor, that will eat anything. They're more likely to eat cats than dogs. More cats get eaten in Burma than dogs. Cats are considered to be good eats, whereas dog meat, people that eat dog meat are looked down upon by the mainstream of Burmese society, unless maybe you're in Karen state or something. So I'm just going to move on to Ecstasies' third question, which is, did you start meditating because it was easy for you or not? No, actually, it was not easy for me at all. Just by nature, I'm a crappy meditator. That I have a high-strung, nervous kind of mind, and it was very difficult to meditate. Sometimes meditating would be like being a cowboy at a rodeo riding a bucking bronco. So, yeah, it was not easier for me. It was very difficult. Like before I became a monk, I'd try to meditate. I'd set up like a timer for 30 minutes. And I mean, it would just seem like it was taking forever. You know, it was hard just to sit still for 30 minutes. Or I'd light an incense stick, and you know, after a while you think, oh, it should be about gone. I open my eyes and it's, you know, it's still like half unburnt still. So no, I was going against my nature really in becoming a professional full-time meditator. And I had to meditate like hard a lot for years before I started really getting into what could be called like deep meditative states. So by nature, I am not a good meditator. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And this is the second to last question. The last two questions are from Fred. And Fred says, the sutta with Sati the fisherman's son is a bit problematic. ? Most people would assume his assumption was correct. Can you comment on this? If the psychic chain jumps, surely it must be connected. So he's referring to a question asked in the previous Q&A about a sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya in which a monk named Sati, who was a fisherman's son, which is setting him up for being a fool because it works this way in the suttas. If like a monk with foolish ideas is going to come from like a low status family or low status like tradition or something, and for a Buddhist, a fisherman is a professional killer, bad karma, not good. So anyways, Sati the fisherman's son, who was an ordained monk, nevertheless had this idea that it is consciousness that moves from one life to the next, that's like the self. You know, it's like your consciousness is what reincarnates. The same consciousness goes into a new body, is essentially his idea. And he was denounced and scolded by the Buddha for believing such a thing. And the main way of understanding this is that, like I was saying earlier, it's a different consciousness from one moment to the next. It's like a flame. The flame is constantly changing. One moment to the next, it is a different flame, even though similar conditions are creating a similar flame. It's not exactly the same. And it's the same with consciousness. It's not exactly the same consciousness. Similar conditions are creating a similar consciousness from one moment to the next. And eventually, according to Theravada Buddhist philosophy, at the moment of rebirth linking consciousness, it actually has to jump from one body to the next. Or rather, it's not really jumping because it disappears in one body and then reappears in a new body. Like a fertilized egg. In the case of if you're being reborn as an animal, including a human animal on this planet. I mean, if you're reborn in some of the heaven realms or the hell realms, it may be you just assume adult form spontaneously in the moment of birth. So, I mean, the main thing to bear in mind is it's not the same consciousness from one moment to the next, even in this life. So, when you die in this life and your consciousness reappears through rebirth linking consciousness into a new life, it's going to be a similar consciousness, a similar karmic stream. Mainly it's the karma that's similar, not necessarily the consciousness even. But it's not the same consciousness, and it's not even exactly the same karma because it's like a flame or a river or the electricity going through a wire. It's different from one moment to the next. It's not the same. There is no underlying stable essence. It's just the conditions that cause it to exist happen to be there, and the conditions are changing from one moment to the next, even though they remain similar usually. And so the consciousness or the karma, I mean, it continues to arise even though it's not exactly the same. So I'm just going to move on to Fred's second question, which is the last question of this Q&A. And this is, we're way less than 2.5 hours. This is a short one. And Fred says, can Nibbana be experienced really? And that's kind of a trick question. I mean, in a way, we're experiencing Nibbana now. Nibbana is reality. Nibbana is reality unfiltered through perceptual ideas and images thoughts, words, perceptions in general. Perception is samsara. So the thing is, it's sort of like Eckhart Tolle says that, I mean, we got it now. I mean, how far away are you from reality? I mean, you're soaking in it. You're like a fish soaking in water while at the same time being oblivious to the fact that it's wet. So, I mean, you're just pervaded through and through with Nibbāna, or the highest truth, God, if you want to call it that, the Tao, Brahman, whatever. The absolute. But I mean, even calling it the absolute is too much. I mean, we have to call it something if we're going to try and talk about it, if we're going to try to understand it through speech. You have to use words, but the words are just, I mean, it doesn't really apply. It's just invalid. But let's just say reality is always here, and Nibbana is reality. So, I mean, we're experiencing it at a subliminal level. But like Eckhart Tolle says, it's like you've got it now, but your mind is making so much noise that you don't notice it. And that's pretty much it, really. So, I mean, I guess when you become enlightened, you're just no longer distracted by all the perceptions, and you're more aware of it, like at a fully conscious level. Whereas right now, it's just sort of this subliminal, subconscious kind of awareness. But it's still there. And in a way, we don't really experience it more when we're enlightened than we do now. It's just that it's pure, it's less obscured. But in a way, when we are enlightened, we're more conscious. So I guess if we're more conscious, we'd be more aware of whatever it is we're aware of. But in answer to the question, a simple question, can Nibbana be experienced really? I think it's a trick question. I don't think that like yes or no is really valid. But in a sense, you can say, sure, yeah, we can experience reality. That's when we're enlightened, we are experiencing ultimate reality fully consciously. And that's it. And like I should always say at the beginning and almost never do, if you have any questions you think I can answer with regard to early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Buddhism in general, you know, the evolution of Buddhism, meditation, I mean, certain other kinds of philosophy and religion. I mean, I'm no authority on all of them, but I have a fairly good working knowledge of certain aspects of it all. Western philosophy, even Burma, living in Asia, living in the forest, that kind of stuff. Just with regard to me personally, I can answer those questions fairly easily as a general rule. So if you think I can answer a question, feel free to include them in the comments below. And no more than 3 questions per episode, please. Because if we're asking unlimited numbers of questions, there's bound to be people who are going to be asking like 10 questions. And then we can be going up over 4 hours in me trying to answer them. And smash the like button. That's what you're supposed to do. You don't just press it. You don't just tap it. You smash the son of a bitch. And subscribe if you haven't already. And be happy.